In the previous video, I traced how the 1950s rebuilt leadership research on a behavioral foundation and how that same decade launched the theory movement in educational administration. By the end of that video, two patterns had become unmistakable. First, the behavioral paradigm's best style assumption was beginning to crack. Consideration and initiating structure improved different outcomes in different settings, and no single combination worked everywhere. Second, educational administration had set out to become a scientific discipline rather than anecdotes and personal experience passed down from retired superintendents and school principals. If you have not watched that video, I encourage you to do so first, because the 1960s pick up both of those threads and push them much further. Let's first return to the unresolved problem from the end of the last video. Behavioral researchers throughout the 1950s had accumulated a frustrating pattern of inconsistent findings. Fleischman and Harris found that leaders high in consideration experience fewer employee grievances and less turnover than leaders low in consideration, and that high consideration appeared to soften the negative effects of an otherwise heavily task-oriented style. That was a meaningful finding, but it also posed a puzzle. The same leadership behavior produced different outcomes depending on the surrounding conditions, and nobody had yet built a rigorous theory that specified exactly which conditions mattered and how. Fred Fiedler is the scholar most responsible for solving that puzzle. Fiedler had been developing his core measurement tool since the late 1950s, and the tool is called the Least Preferred Coworker Scale, also known as LPC. The logic of the LPC scale captures something very clever about Fiedler's approach. He asked leaders to think of one coworker with whom they had the most difficulty working, and then to rate that person on a series of descriptive scales. Leaders who describe their least preferred coworker in relatively generous terms tended to be relationship-oriented leaders. They viewed this coworker as still somewhat pleasant or competent, despite the difficulty of working with them. Leaders who describe that same difficult coworker in harshly negative terms tended to be task-motivated leaders. The brilliance of this measurement is that instead of asking leaders to describe their own style, which invites self-flattering bias, Fiedler inferred motivational orientation from how leaders talked about someone they disliked. Fiedler formally proposed his contingency model in a 1964 article and developed fully in his 1967 book, A Theory of Leadership Effectiveness. The theory's central claim is that a leader's effectiveness depends on the interaction between that leader's motivational style, task-motivated or relationship-motivated, and what Fiedler called situational favorability. Situational favorability, in turn, depends on three variables. Leader-member relations describe the degree of trust and rapport between the leader and the group. Task structure describes how clearly defined and routine the group's work is. Leader position power describes the formal authority that comes built into the leader's role itself, independent of the leader's personal quality. When Fiedler combined those variables across many studies, the results surprised the field. Task-motivated leaders, the low LPC leaders, perform best at the extremes in situations of very high favorability, where everything was running smoothly and the leader could simply focus on the task, and in situations of very low favorability, where things were going so poorly that someone needed to take firm and directive control. Relationship-motivated leaders, the high LPC leaders, performed best in the moderate middle ground, where some ambiguity and interpersonal friction existed, but the situation was not an outright crisis. We can explain these findings by using a sports analogy. A team that is comfortably winning and a team that is in danger of total collapse often benefits from a coach who simply directs play without much deliberation. A team that is competitive but uncertain, where morale and cohesion are fragile, often benefits more from a coach who first attends to relationships and trust before pushing hard on tactics. Fiedler's finding carried enormous theoretical weight because it demonstrated something the field had never empirically shown before. Neither leadership style is universally superior. Each style has a domain in which it excels, and that domain is defined by measurable situational variables instead of ambiguous intuition. Fiedler's model generated a substantial wave of follow-up research through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Those studies tested and refined its predictions. Later critics would question the psychological meaning of the LPC scale itself, and some would challenge Fiedler's assumption that leadership style is essentially fixed instead of adaptable. We'll return to those critics later in this video, but Fiedler's core contribution was the idea that situational context systematically moderates the relationship between leadership style and effectiveness. And this insight became the foundational idea for an entire era of leadership research. Once Fiedler had demonstrated that contingency thinking could be rigorously modeled and empirically tested, other scholars began developing related theories that shared its core logic while emphasizing different situational variables. None of those theories reached full publication in the 1960s itself, but all of them took intellectual shape during this decade, and understanding their origins here helps make sense of the 1970s, which we'll cover in the next video. Robert House began formulating what would become path goal theory at the very end of the 1960s, although the theory was not fully published until 1971. I've already introduced this path goal theory in my series of Game of Theories. Drawing on expectancy theory from psychology, particularly Victor Room's 1964 work on motivation, House argued that a leader's central job is to clarify the path between the follower's effort and the follower's goals and remove obstacles along the way. House proposed that leaders should choose among 4 behavioral styles: directive, supportive, participative, and achievement-oriented, depending on followers' characteristics, such as skill level and locus of control, and environmental factors such as task structure. Notice how directly this builds on contingency logic. Instead of Fiedler's leader-member relations and position power, House specified a different but related set of moderating conditions. A parallel development came from Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard, who began articulating what they called a life cycle theory of leadership in 1969, and later popularized in the early 1970s as situational leadership theory. Their core argument was that leaders should adjust their leadership style based on follower maturity, which is a combination of followers' competence and their willingness or commitment. A new experienced employee requires more directive guidance. A highly competent, motivated employee requires more delegation and autonomy. Although Hersey and Blanchard's theory would not achieve wide practitioner influence until the following decades, its theoretical roots lies in the late 1960s recognition that follower characteristics, not just task and authority structure, belong in any serious contingency model. It's worth pausing here to ask an important question. Why did the 3 independent groups of scholars converge on contingency logic within roughly the same 5-year model? Part of the answer is intellectual momentum. Once Fiedler demonstrated that the contingency approach was both theoretically coherent and empirically testable, it became an obvious template for other researchers to extend. But part of the answer also lies in the social conditions of the 1960s: rapid institutional change, generational conflict, and the obvious failure of rigid, one-size-fits-all management approaches in turbulent organizations made the idea of a single, universal leadership style increasingly unrealistic. Scholars were responding to a world that no longer looked uniform enough to support uniform theories. Contingency thinking did not stay confined in the 1960s and 1970s. It became the default assumption of contemporary leadership research. Almost every leadership theory developed since this decade of the 1960s, including transformational leadership, servant leadership, authentic leadership, and instructional leadership in educational settings, almost all of those theories building some mechanism for situational variation instead of prescribing one universal best practice. Leadership preparation programs today routinely teach administrators to diagnose their context, the experience level of their teaching staff, the trust level of the school building, the pressure coming from the district or state accountability system before selecting a leadership approach. That the diagnostic mindset of treating leadership not as a formula but as a fitting problem is a direct descendant of Fiedler's contingency theory of leadership. The 1960s also saw leadership research absorb ideas from psychology and sociology that did not fit neatly into the contingent theory, but proved equally consequential for the field's long-term theory development. Douglas McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y was published in 1960 in the Human Side of Enterprise. This work deserves mention here because although McGregor began developing those ideas in the 1950s, their full influence unfolded through the 1960s. McGregor argued that managers operate from one of the two underlying assumption sets about human nature. Theory X assumes that employees are inherently lazy and must be controlled through close supervision. This assumption tends to produce authoritarian leadership. Theory Y assumes that employees are capable of self-direction and intrinsically seek responsibility. This assumption tends to produce participative leadership. McGregor's deeper point was that those assumptions function as self-fulfilling prophecies. A manager who assumes laziness will create the very conditions to produce disengaged and passive employees. But a manager who assumes capability will create conditions that elicit initiative and commitment. McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y resonated well beyond business management. It was taken up in educational administration and public administration as an argument for more humanistic, trust-based leadership. Rances Likert continued to extend his Michigan research program through this decade. He published The Human Organization in 1967 as a follow-up to his 1961 book, New Patterns of Management. Likert formalized a four-system typology of organizational climate, ranging from System 1, which he called exploitative authoritative, to System 4, which he called participative. His survey evidence across industrial settings consistently associated System 4 climates with better performance and higher morale than System 1 climates. Robert Blake and Jane Mouton's managerial grid was published in 1964. They offered a related but distinct framework by plotting leadership style along two axes, concern for production and concern for people, with the ideal team style combining high scores on both dimensions. Notice the resemblance here to the Ohio State consideration and initiating structure dimensions from the 1950s. The 1960s did not abandon the behavioral paradigm. It absorbed the behavioral paradigm into richer, more applied model, while contingency theory developed alongside it as a parallel and ultimately more theoretically generative line of inquiry. Sociology contributed a different and in some way more provocative set of ideas. Edwin Hollander's work reconceived leadership as a two-way exchange relationship instead of one-directional act performed by leader upon followers. Hollander introduced the concept of idiosyncrasy credits, the idea that a leader who has earned prestige by contributing competently to a group accumulates a kind of social credit that grants latitude to deviate from group norms. In 1964, Hollander published Leaders, Groups, and Influence, and by 1969, writing with James Julian, he reviewed the field's emerging trends and explicitly argued that Leadership should be understood as a dynamic exchange process instead of a fixed quality residing in one person. This relational perspective laid the foundation for leader-member exchange theory, which would not be formally developed until the mid-1970s, but the theoretical logic is already visible here. Max Weber's earlier typology of charismatic, traditional, and legal rational authority, though written decades earlier, was rediscovered and applied with new urgency during the 1960s. This is not a coincidence. This decade's most visible public leaders, figures like John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., embodied a form of influence that neither trade theory, behavioral theory, nor early contingency theory had been built to explain. Scholars did not yet have a fully developed theory of charismatic or transformational leadership in the 1960s. That would come in the following 2 decades. But the social and political conditions of this decade made the limitations of purely transactional task and relationship leadership models increasingly visible, and that visibility planted intellectual seeds that later scholars writing in the 1970s and 1980s would explicitly trace back to their observations of the 1960s political leaders. In the subfield of educational administration, its theory movement launched in the 1950s entered what scholars often describe as its second decade during the 1960s. Much of the theoretical borrowing continued along the established lines. Bureaucracy and socialization, group cohesion, organizational climate, and organizational communication structure. Those main ideas imported from sociology and general administrative science remained dominant. It's worth noting that organizational theory, more broadly, was undergoing its own foundational consolidation during the 1950s and 1960s. Scholars increasingly conceptualize organizations as complex systems by process dynamics that produce emergent phenomena across different levels of the system. This is the idea with roots extending back to at least the 1930s in the human relations tradition. This system perspective gave the educational administration scholars a richer vocabulary for describing schools as something more than simple bureaucratic hierarchies, and it will prove foundational for the open system theory that became prominent in educational leadership in the following decades. Several things were new in this decade, and they help explain both the content and the urgency of theory development in the 1960s. The most consequential one in the United States was the Civil Rights Movement and its legislative achievements. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and it dismantled the legal architecture of segregation in schools and workplaces. For educational leadership, it forced leaders and the scholars who study them to confront questions of equality that earlier behavioral models had simply never been built to address. A leadership theory calibrated entirely around employee morale and production quotas had little to say about a school district ordered to desegregate. That tension became immediate in American public education. President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty produced 2 major pieces of legislation in 1965 alone. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act is the most far-reaching federal education legislation ever passed by Congress to that point. The ESEA Act directed supplemental federal funding towards disadvantaged students. The Head Start program, also launched that year, aimed to promote school readiness among children ages 3 to 5. Then in 1966, sociologist James Coleman published what became to be called the Coleman Report, formally titled Equality of Education Opportunity, which was commissioned by the federal government. The Coleman Report documented stark and persistent inequality in educational opportunity across racial and socio-economic lines, and it remained one of the most cited studies in the history of educational leadership research. Consider what this meant for the field. Educational administration could no longer treat itself purely as an internal, technical question of how principals motivate teachers, it had become entangled with the questions of federal policy and the broader machinery of American social reform. Internationally, the 1960s marked the moment educational leadership stopped being an almost exclusively American field of study. The United Kingdom and other Commonwealth countries began establishing educational administration as a formal area of research and practice during this decade. 3 research journals founded in the 1960s gave that internationalization a permanent infrastructure. The Journal of Educational Administration published its first volume in 1963 under the founding editor, William Walker, an Australian scholar. Its inaugural issue covered teacher morale in Australian high school and the question of whether seemingly authoritarian Catholic schools could be governed democratically. 2 years later, in 1965, Educational Administration Quarterly published its first volume. It addressed intervening variables in organizational behavior and teacher mobility in New York City. And in 1968, the Journal of Educational Administration and History was founded. This journal focused specifically on historical scholarship in the field. The 3 journals give educational leadership researchers for the very first time dedicated international outlets for disseminating empirical work. And that infrastructure mattered enormously for a field trying to establish itself as a scientific discipline. And finally, the broader scientific culture of the 1960s was unusually fertile across many disciplines simultaneously. And some of that intellectual energy filtered into leadership research indirectly. In psychology, the field was undergoing what's often called the cognitive revolution, which is a decisive shift away from pure behaviorism towards theories of internal mental processes such as memory, perception, and reasoning. For leadership scholars, this transition mattered because it eventually opened the door to study not just what leaders do, but how followers perceive and mentally represent leadership. This is a line of inquiry that would not fully mature until the cognitive and implicit leadership theories of later decades, but the intellectual seeds were already planted here. Why does this decade of the 1960s matter so much for everything that follows? Because it established a methodological and a theoretical approach that the field has never abandoned. Specify the conditions under which a leadership style works, rather than searching for one leadership style that works everywhere. In my next video, we'll move into the 1970s when scholars will refine, test, and in some cases, challenge the contingency theorists born in this decade. When pass-goal theory and Room and Yatton's normative decision model reach full publication, and when the field's accumulating frustration with purely transactional leadership models will begin pointing toward something new.